Good morning or good evening, wherever you're joining me from. I'm Dr. Lee Jin-yun, and before we start, I want to say something that might sound unusual coming from a physician. I am not going to tell you that your legs are getting weaker simply because you're getting older. Age is a number. What actually weakens an aging body is a set of specific, correctable gaps in protein, in blood flow, in a handful of compounds most people have never heard of. Today I want to walk through 6 foods that the research consistently points to when we talk about preserving leg strength, mobility, and independence after 60. I'm not going to promise you a miracle, and I'm not going to tell you that any single ingredient will undo decades of change in a few weeks. I am going to show you what the evidence actually says, where it's strong, where it's genuinely early and still developing, and what a realistic, sustainable pattern of eating looks like if your goal is to keep walking, climbing stairs, and getting up from a chair without a second thought for as long as possible. That distinction between strong and early evidence matters, and I think you deserve to hear it laid out honestly, rather than flattened into a confident-sounding list. Let's start with some context, because I think it changes how you'll hear everything that follows. After about age 60, most people begin losing skeletal muscle mass at a rate of roughly 1 to 2% per year, and that loss accelerates further after 75. Researchers call this sarcopenia. It's not just a cosmetic change. Lower muscle mass and reduced leg strength are linked to a higher risk of falls, slower recovery from illness, longer hospital stays, and loss of independence. Grip strength and leg strength specifically are used by researchers as some of the strongest predictors of how well someone recovers from an illness, a surgery, or even just a rough winter indoors. The encouraging part, and I want to spend a moment on this because it's genuinely encouraging, is that muscle tissue keeps its capacity to rebuild well into old age. It's not a one-way slope. Muscle responds to the right inputs at 70 the same way it responds at 40, just somewhat less efficiently. Which is exactly why the specific foods you choose start to matter more, not less, as the years go by. The rest of this video is about what those inputs are, food by food, along with an honest look at how strong or how preliminary the research behind each one actually is. I would rather tell you where the evidence is thin than oversell you on certainty that doesn't exist. Number 6 on the list is eggs, and I know the reputation eggs carry. For decades, people were told to avoid the yolk because of cholesterol concerns. Current nutrition science has moved past a lot of that blanket advice, and for older adults specifically, eggs deserve a second look. The reason centers on an amino acid called leucine. Leucine acts as one of the primary triggers for a process called muscle protein synthesis, essentially the biological machinery your body uses to build and repair muscle fiber. As we age, our muscles become somewhat less responsive to normal amounts of dietary protein, a phenomenon researchers describe as anabolic resistance, meaning it typically takes a stronger stimulus, like a higher leucine dose in a single meal, to trigger the same building response that used to happen automatically. There's an important nuance here worth being honest about. Not every study agrees on how large or universal anabolic resistance is in healthy older adults, and leucine supplementation alone doesn't reliably prevent muscle loss during things like short-term immobility from illness or injury. But across a large body of research, adequate leucine intake, especially spread across meals, remains one of the more consistently supported levers for supporting muscle protein synthesis in older adults. 2 whole eggs provide a meaningful dose of leucine, along with a very high-quality, easily absorbed protein profile. The yolk also contributes choline and vitamin D, 2 nutrients that a large share of older adults don't get enough of. If you eat eggs, there's no strong evidence that older adults without specific cardiovascular risk factors need to avoid the yolk. Talk with your own physician about your individual cholesterol picture, since this varies person to person. A reasonable pattern many geriatric nutrition specialists recommend is 2 eggs a few times a week as part of a protein-forward breakfast, alongside a source of healthy fat, since some of the nutrients in the yolk are fat-soluble and absorb better that way. One more point worth making here because it comes up constantly in my practice. Protein distribution across the day appears to matter almost as much as total protein intake. A lot of older adults grew up eating a light breakfast, a modest lunch, and a large dinner, which often means very little protein until the evening. If your muscles need a strong leucine signal to overcome that anabolic resistance we talked about, and that signal only arrives once a day, you're leaving a lot of the day's muscle-building potential on the table. Eggs are one of the simplest ways to front-load a real protein dose earlier in the day, when you're also likely to be more physically active, which itself amplifies how well that protein gets used. Number 5 is wild-caught salmon. And here the story is about inflammation and vitamin D as much as protein. Chronic low-grade inflammation tends to rise with age, and it appears to interfere with the same muscle-building signaling pathways we just discussed. Salmon is rich in the omega-3 fatty acids EPA and DHA, which have well-documented anti-inflammatory properties. What's genuinely interesting is a randomized controlled trial out of Washington University School of Medicine, published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, which gave 16 healthy older adults either omega-3 fatty acid supplementation or corn oil for 8 weeks. The omega-3 group showed a meaningfully greater increase in muscle protein synthesis in response to a nutrient stimulus, along with greater activation of the same mTOR signaling pathway that leucine engages. It was a small study, 16 people, so I don't want to overstate it, but it's a real, registered clinical trial, and its findings have been echoed in follow-up work from the same research group, showing increases in muscle mass and function with longer-term fish oil intake in healthy older adults. Salmon also happens to be one of the few naturally rich dietary sources of vitamin D, a nutrient that's genuinely important for muscle function and that a large percentage of older adults are low in, particularly in winter months or with limited sun exposure. 2 to 3 servings of fatty fish per week is a reasonable target most cardiology and geriatric nutrition guidelines support, and wild-caught salmon tends to carry a more favorable omega fatty acid ratio than farmed varieties, though both provide meaningful omega-3 content. There's also a practical, everyday version of this benefit that doesn't show up in a lab measurement, but that patients describe to me often: less morning stiffness. Chronic low-grade inflammation is part of why joints and muscles can feel tight or achy on waking, and while I won't claim salmon eliminates that, a diet consistently higher in omega-3s and lower in the pro-inflammatory fats found in a lot of processed and fried food tends to track with people reporting that their mornings feel a little easier. If salmon isn't accessible or affordable where you live, sardines, mackerel, and trout carry similar omega-3 and vitamin D profiles and are often considerably cheaper. Number 4 is spinach and other dark leafy greens, and this is where we get into something researchers call the nitrate pathway. As blood vessels age, they lose some of their ability to dilate efficiently, partly because of declining nitric oxide availability. Nitric oxide is the molecule responsible for relaxing and widening blood vessels, which matters enormously for how well oxygen and nutrients reach working leg muscles. Leafy greens are naturally high in dietary nitrates, which the body converts, through a process involving oral bacteria, into nitric oxide. There's solid research specifically in older populations here. A study published in PLOS One gave older adults a beetroot-based nitrate gel and measured muscle oxygen recovery and grip strength after hand grip exercise. The nitrate group recovered oxygen saturation faster and showed less decline in strength 30 minutes after exercise compared to placebo. Separate research using flow-mediated dilation measurements in the leg specifically found that acute dietary nitrate supplementation improved blood vessel responsiveness in the superficial femoral artery, the main artery supplying the thigh, in healthy older men. Spinach is also one of the better dietary sources of magnesium, a mineral involved in muscle contraction and relaxation. A systematic review in the Journal of the American Medical Directors Association found magnesium status was one of the minerals most consistently associated with muscle mass, strength, and physical performance in older adults, alongside selenium. Muscle cramping, particularly at night, is sometimes linked to inadequate magnesium status, though cramping has multiple possible causes and is worth mentioning to your doctor if it's frequent or severe. A cup of cooked spinach a few times a week, ideally with a bit of olive oil to help absorb the fat-soluble nutrients alongside it, is a simple, low-risk way to work more of this into your diet. I'll add one caution here because it's important and often left out of these lists. If you're on blood thinners like warfarin, the vitamin K content in leafy greens interacts with that medication, and sudden large changes in your intake can affect your levels. That doesn't mean avoid spinach. It means keep your intake roughly consistent week to week and mention it to whoever manages your anticoagulation so your dosing stays properly calibrated. This is exactly the kind of detail I think gets lost when health content tries to make every food sound universally perfect for everyone. It generally isn't, and your own medication list matters. This next part isn't a sales pitch. I mean it sincerely. If any of this is new and useful to you, consider subscribing, because every week we go through research like this in plain language, the kind that doesn't always make it into a 15-minute doctor's visit. Number 3 is Greek yogurt, plain and full fat if your diet allows for it. A single cup delivers somewhere around 17 to 20 grams of high-quality, easily absorbed protein, including a good leucine content. But the feature that's gotten more research attention recently is what scientists call the gut-muscle axis, the relationship between gut microbiome health and muscle mass and function. A 2024 systematic review looking specifically at older adults found that greater diversity of gut bacteria and higher levels of certain butyrate-producing bacterial species were associated with better grip strength and muscle performance, while lower diversity was associated with greater sarcopenia severity. Separate research measuring gut microbiome composition alongside hand grip strength in older inpatients found distinct metabolic and microbial signatures associated with weaker grip strength. I want to be careful here because this is a genuinely new and still developing area of research. Most of these are association studies, not trials proving that eating more probiotic-rich food directly increases strength. But it's a promising enough signal that many researchers in geriatric nutrition consider fermented probiotic-containing foods a reasonable addition to a muscle-supportive diet, and Greek yogurt is one of the easiest ways to get both quality protein and live cultures in one food. If you tolerate dairy well, a cup a few times a week, plain rather than sweetened, is a sensible choice. If dairy doesn't agree with you, you're not missing out on the whole benefit. Other fermented foods, kefir, if you can tolerate it in small amounts even with some lactose sensitivity, or plant-based fermented options like plain, unsweetened kefir alternatives, offer some overlapping probiotic exposure, though the protein content won't be nearly as high, so you'd want to pair them with another protein source. The research consensus right now is less about any single fermented food being magic, and more about gut microbial diversity in general, tracking with better muscle outcomes. So variety across several fermented and fiber-rich foods over the course of a week is probably more useful than fixating on one product. Now let me pause and tell you about a patient. And I want to be transparent that this is a composite story, not one individual, put together from patterns I've seen repeatedly in patients working on leg strength and mobility, so you can see how these pieces come together in real life rather than just in isolated studies. I'll call her Grace Park. Grace was 73, had had 2 falls in 8 months, and had spent years avoiding fat and egg yolks specifically because of advice she'd received decades earlier. Over about 3 months, we made incremental changes together. Eggs a few mornings a week, salmon twice weekly, more leafy greens, and a switch from sweetened yogurt to plain. None of it was dramatic on its own, and we also added short daily walks and simple chair-based leg exercises, because I want to be honest that diet wasn't the only variable that changed. What she told me mattered most wasn't a single food. It was that she stopped needing to hold the railing going down her stairs, and she started walking to the mailbox again without planning it as an event, something she said she hadn't done in over a year. I share that not as proof. One improving patient, real or composite, doesn't validate a food, and I'm not able to isolate which single change mattered most for her, but because it illustrates how these small, boring, consistent changes tend to compound in a way that a list of 6 foods on its own can make sound more dramatic than daily life actually feels. Number 2 is beets, and I understand this one raises a few eyebrows. Beets contain dietary nitrates in higher concentration than most leafy greens, and the same nitric oxide pathway we discussed with spinach applies here, more intensely. The clinical trial research specifically in older adults is genuinely compelling. Beyond the hand grip and femoral artery studies I already mentioned, a study out of the University of Exeter, one of the largest of its kind, found that older adults drinking nitrate-rich beetroot juice twice daily for 2 weeks saw meaningful reductions in blood pressure, an effect that was not observed to the same degree in younger participants, and the researchers linked it to specific, favorable shifts in oral bacteria that improve nitrate to nitric oxide conversion. Better blood pressure control and more efficient nitric oxide conversion both support the kind of circulation that aging leg muscles depend on for oxygen and nutrient delivery during activity and recovery. Roasting beets at around 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 45 minutes to an hour is a reasonable way to prepare them without excessive nitrate loss, since boiling for long periods can leach out some of the water-soluble nitrate content. 2 to 3 servings a week, alongside a source of lean protein, is a pattern several of the trials I mentioned modeled their interventions on. One thing worth knowing if you try this: it's common and completely harmless for beets to temporarily turn urine or stool a pink or reddish color, a phenomenon called beeturia. It surprises people the first time, and it's not a sign of anything wrong. On the other end, if you have a history of kidney stones, particularly the oxalate type, beets and spinach both carry meaningful oxalate content, so it's worth a quick conversation with your physician about how much fits your particular history before making either one a daily habit rather than a few times a week addition. And now, number 1, extra virgin olive oil. If you are expecting a protein or a superfood powder, I understand, but the research here is some of the most consistent in this entire list, largely because olive oil sits at the center of the Mediterranean dietary pattern, which has decades of observational and interventional research behind it specifically related to healthy aging. The compounds of interest are polyphenols, oleocanthal, and hydroxytyrosol are the 2 most studied. Oleocanthal has a genuinely striking property. It inhibits some of the same inflammatory enzyme pathways, COX1 and COX2, that anti-inflammatory medications target, though at levels from food rather than a pharmaceutical dose. A 2018 randomized controlled trial protocol and subsequent research from groups studying carotenoid and polyphenol-rich diets, including extra virgin olive oil, in overweight and obese older adults, found that higher plasma polyphenol and carotenoid levels were inversely associated with sarcopenia symptoms during a weight loss intervention, meaning participants with higher levels tended to retain more muscle function even while losing weight, a period that typically puts muscle mass at risk. A more recent pilot study using a polyphenol-rich olive oil byproduct supplement found modest but measurable increases in skeletal muscle mass percentage and limb circumference in adults at metabolic risk over the study period, alongside improved hydration status. I want to be fair to the evidence here. Most of this research shows association and modest effect sizes rather than dramatic transformation, and much of it comes from concentrated polyphenol extracts rather than olive oil as most people cook with it day to day. Still, across the broader Mediterranean diet literature, extra virgin olive oil consistently correlates with lower rates of frailty and sarcopenia in older populations. Using it as your primary cooking and finishing oil, in the range of 2 to 4 tablespoons a day, as several of these studies modeled, fits comfortably within standard dietary guidelines for older adults, and carries essentially none of the downside risk that comes with many supplement-based interventions. If you're shopping for it, a couple of practical notes matter more than most labels let on. Polyphenol content genuinely does degrade with light and time, so a dark glass bottle stored away from direct sunlight and used within a few months of opening will simply contain more of the compounds we've been discussing than a bottle that's been sitting on a sunlit shelf for a year. A harvest date on the label, where available, tends to be a more useful freshness indicator than the expiration date alone. None of this requires an expensive specialty product. A reasonably fresh, good quality extra virgin olive oil from a standard grocery store is entirely sufficient for the benefits we've discussed. I want to bring this together simply. None of these 6 foods is a cure, and no legitimate researcher in this field would tell you otherwise. What the evidence does support is a pattern. Adequate, high-quality protein spread across your day, regular intake of oily fish for its anti-inflammatory and vitamin D contribution, nitrate-rich vegetables like leafy greens and beets to support the blood flow your leg muscles depend on. Fermented dairy for both protein and a possible gut muscle benefit still being actively researched, and extra virgin olive oil as your primary fat source. I also want to be honest about the one thing on this list that matters more than any single food, because it would be misleading not to say it plainly. Regular resistance and weight-bearing exercise remains the single most well-supported intervention we have for maintaining leg strength in older adults, by a considerable margin. Even modest amounts, chair squats, wall push-ups, short walks with a few hills or stairs worked in, produce changes in muscle strength and function that no diet alone can replicate. Nutrition and exercise aren't competing strategies. They work through overlapping and reinforcing pathways. The protein and the leucine we discussed with eggs need a stimulus to act on, and resistance exercise is that stimulus. The improved blood flow from nitrates matters most when your leg muscles are actually being asked to work. Food gives your body the raw material. Movement is what tells your body to use it. None of this needs to happen all at once, and I'd actively discourage trying to overhaul your entire diet in a single week. Pick one thing from this list that you're not already doing regularly, add it consistently for a month, and notice how you feel before adding the next one. Small, sustained changes tend to outperform dramatic, short-lived ones, in nutrition research and in my own clinical experience both. Muscle tissue retains its ability to rebuild well into your 80s and 90s. The science on that point is not seriously in dispute, and I think that's genuinely worth holding on to. If you found this useful, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you subscribed, and I'd love to hear in the comments which of these 6 you're already eating regularly, and which one you're going to add this week. I read what you write. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.